In this video, we're going to learn how to take source images like this and transform them into an engaging composition like this in preparation to paint it like this. In this project, I'll be using Photoshop to compose. If you have Photoshop and would like to follow along, great. If you don't have Photoshop, don't worry, you will still glean the same composition lessons by simply watching, or you might prefer to draw the composition by hand. This video is actually an excerpt from a full course I have uploaded to Skillshare. In that course, I also offer a step-by-step demo on painting the composition that I'll be creating in this video. If you're interested in the Skillshare course or checking out my other painting classes, please follow the link in the show notes. Okay, we're going to work on creating an engaging composition from these two source images, and a third one we'll reference later. So these are the compositional principles of design. We're going to focus on these four: balance and harmony, arrangement, path of the viewer's eye, and contrast. Now we're not going to ignore the other principles. Somewhat by default, we'll also be considering shape and proportion, negative space, color, and illumination. But these four are the ones we'll focus on. To assist us in addressing these principles, we're going to use the sacred geometry of the golden ratio and the Fibonacci spiral. Let's begin with a quick primer on exactly what the golden ratio and Fibonacci spiral are. So if we create a line we call AC and then try to place a point B on this line such that AC is to AB as AB is to BC, you will have discovered the golden ratio, and that number is 1.618. Alternately, we can express the ratio of AB to AC as 0.618. Or more practically speaking, we can say that according to the golden ratio, point B is about 62% across line AC. And this is the number we're going to be using as we compose our painting. This golden ratio is found on faces, fingers, and throughout nature, even including the structure of DNA. The golden ratio also shares an interesting relationship with the Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical sequence in which each number is the sum of the two preceding ones. When the numbers in this sequence get sufficiently large, the ratio of two successive numbers will be 1.618, the same number as the ratio of the golden mean. And it gets crazier. If we tile squares whose side lengths are successive Fibonacci numbers, we get a grid that looks like this. If we then draw quarter circles from corner to corner in each of the squares, we get the Fibonacci spiral. And once again, this pattern shows up throughout nature, from the smallest seashells to the largest galaxies. In fact, the golden ratio and the Fibonacci spiral show up so much in the world around us that we barely even notice they're there. They hide in plain sight. In other words, we don't even notice them until they're absent. It's when they're absent that things begin to feel a little bit off, out of kilter, and in disharmony. This is why architects, designers, and artists, going all the way back to at least ancient Greece, have used this sacred geometry to create a sense of balance and harmony. So now let's see if we can do the same. As you might have guessed, we're going to borrow elements from both of these source images, and as you may have also guessed, we're going to borrow the flowers from this one on the left, which are much more interesting than the flowers on the right. But we are going to borrow the leaves, the pot, and this cutting board that we're going to turn into a round table. We're going to borrow those elements from the image on the right. We're also going to use this background on the left. So these are going to become three separate layers. In other words, the flowers over here are going to be a layer, the background is going to be a layer, and then the leaves, pot, and table from this image on the right are going to be another layer, and we're going to mash these together and use the Fibonacci spiral. We're going to change the orientation of these flowers to follow a little bit more of a Fibonacci spiral, and we're going to place elements according to the golden ratio and see what we come up with. Okay, let's start by creating our layers. We're going to use the magic wand and choose select subject. And then we're going to add the table. Then we're going to inverse all of this. We're trying to create a background layer here. So we're going to copy that and create a new document with the same size, and then paste the background. So that's going to be our background layer. We go back to our image. And deselect everything that's not the left flower. There we go. And now we can copy that and drop that in place as a new layer. Once again, go back to our original image, hit Command Z, that'll bring our old selection back. And now we're going to go about deselecting everything that's not the right flowers, copy that, again go back to our new image and our new file and drop that in place. So we got 3 layers now. Now we're going to go to our second file over here, our second source image, and choose the leaves, pot, and table from it. We're going to copy that and then drop that in as another layer over here. For clarity's sake, I've renamed all these layers. There's the background, leaves, pot, and table, the left flowers, and the right flowers. And now we're going to come up here and get rid of one of these images by consolidating the layers. It'll enable us to just focus on our composition. And we're going to hide all the layers except the background, and we're going to work on cleaning up the background. We use the magic eraser tool, and this does a surprisingly good job of just kind of filling in the background. AI at work here. So we're going to use that, and then I'm going to use the smudge tool to further kind of clean it up and give it the idea of some painterly brush strokes. And now we have a filled in background. And I'm going to bring back the visibility on each of these layers and clean them up a little bit. There we go. The next thing we're going to do is to place the flower pot in the horizontal according to the golden mean. So in other words, 62% of the way across. Our image is 3,000 pixels wide, so 62% of that is 1860. So we're going to drop a vertical guide at exactly 1860. And what we find is the pot is actually pretty close to properly positioned already, so we're going to just kind of tweak that a little bit, get it nice and exact. Next thing we're going to do is bring in our Fibonacci spiral for guidance. I've brought in this PNG file with a transparent background of a Fibonacci spiral. And we're now going to work on tweaking these flowers on the left to follow this arc, this Fibonacci spiral, as best we can. So to do that, we're just going to use our transform tools of rotating and magnifying and of course repositioning these flowers in an effort, again, just to get it to follow, to get these flowers to follow that Fibonacci spiral. Okay, that feels like progress, but what I'm starting to notice is a lot of dead space in the center of my composition here. So to rectify that, we're going to start magnifying some elements, and we're going to start with the leaves, pot, and table right here. And we'll scale that up. But as we do that, of course, as we're scaling up this layer, we notice that our pot is moving to the left slightly, and we had placed that according to the golden ratio before. So now we're going to have to bring back that guide and reposition our pot so that it is lined up with our guide for the golden ratio. Little extra tweak. Now we notice something very interesting. Almost by accident, this leaf is starting to come very close to tracing our Fibonacci arc. So I'm going to use my lasso tool and select that leaf. And then we're going to come up and choose Transform Warp. That will give us this grid. And then we can tweak the vertices of this grid to make that leaf follow our Fibonacci spiral a little bit more exactly. So far we've scaled up the bottom part of our composition. Now we're going to do the same thing to the flowers. We'll start with the flowers on the left. And then the flowers on the right. And just kind of fine-tune things as needed. I'm going to use the warp function again to place this stem in a position that makes a little bit more sense. So since this project is all about composing according to the golden ratio, maybe we can use that golden ratio somewhere else. And I'm taking a look at this table here. What if we tried to make that table 62% of the horizontal dimension? Let me show you what I mean by that. So before we calculated that 62% of the horizontal 3000 pixels is 1860. So I'm going to make an ellipse that's 1860 pixels wide, and then I'm going to put it in position and see if we can make our table follow that ellipse. To do that, we're going to select the table, working together with our magic wand and lasso tool. And then we'll scale and reposition according to the guide that we've created with our ellipse. Similar to the manner in which we created our different layers at the beginning, we're going to create a different layer now for the table, and also use the magic eraser tool to fill in that void area in the table. As I take a step back now and evaluate the composition, I feel like it can be improved upon if we move the table over to the left slightly to give the whole thing a little more balance, and then to take all the elements of the composition and bring them down a little bit as well. I think these tweaks will just help the overall balance. Next thing I want to do is to create a center of interest using the golden ratio. I have already created that guide that's 62% across the canvas, and now I'm going to create another guide that's 62% of the way up my canvas. So using the golden ratio in both directions, we're going to get an intersection of those two lines, and it's at that point we're going to drop our center of interest in. I've pulled up this image from my photo shoot, and I particularly like this one flower here. I have selected it using the magic wand and lasso tool, and now we're going to copy it into our composition. I've worked on the center of interest a little more, enlarged it and rotated it, put it in place, made it feel a little bit more natural. So things are starting to look pretty good in terms of where all our elements are. Now what we'd like to work on is the lighting. I'd like to make that a little bit more dynamic, and that's going to affect our values, or what we refer to as our value pattern. Now when it comes to composition, artists will often tell you that color gets all the credit, but value does all the work. In other words, how light and dark elements are in your composition can dramatically affect your overall composition. So to discern value, a great tool to use is just our ability to squint. So if you squint at this image, at some point you'll start to see common values start to sort of blend together, and you'll get an idea of what your value pattern looks like. We can also use Photoshop to give us an idea of what that looks like. We're going to go into mode grayscale. It's going to give us all kinds of dire warnings. Don't worry about that. We're going to be able to Control Z out of this. And we're going to go into the filter gallery and choose cutout. And let's go up to 5 levels. Command 0 to give you a full image. And this is going to give you an idea of what our value pattern looks like. So you can definitely see our Fibonacci spiral coming into play. But I think in certainly our center of interest starts to pop. But we can really work with this some more to improve upon that composition. So that's what we're going to be after next. First thing we want to do is make our focal point pop. So we'll go ahead and select the focal point layer, and then we're going to create an adjustment layer. We're going to use curves. And what I want to do is amp up the contrast on this one. So what we're going to do is kind of tweak our curves. Oh, got to go back to curves and hit Option Command G so that our adjustment layer is just altering the focal point layer. So if we play around at this, we can get the shadows a little darker and the highlights a little lighter. So maximum contrast in our focal point area. And the reason we'd like to use an adjustment layer instead of just altering this layer is it's not destructive. I can go back in here and take out that adjustment layer, as you can see if I click off the eyeball, or I can go back in and change this. So this might be something we refer back to as we get deeper into this. Next, I'm going to work on the layer that I've been calling Right Flowers, and I want this area in particular to recede back into the background a little more. So in other words, I want these darker values. So we're going to go into Right Flowers, adjustment layer, and again we're going to go into curves, and on a Mac it's Option Command G to just isolate that layer. And so I want this to be darker, so we're going to drag it down like something like this, and or we can change that. And it's this area that I want to remain light, right? That's part of our Fibonacci spiral. So I can go into the mask right there, make sure you're on black, and I'm going to use my brush, and this area that I don't want affected, I'm just going to paint. So this area where I still want the light to hit, in other words, not to be affected by what we're doing up here, I can mask off. And once I've done that, I can still play around with my curves, and it'll only affect the area that's not masked off. So something like that. If you do your little squint test, you can see your value pattern starting to come in to focus a little bit. Next, I'm going to play around with the left flowers. And again, we'll create an adjustment layer and work with the curves on this layer and see what we come up with. That feels pretty good right there. Next, we're going to work on the table. So again, an adjustment layer and again, curves. And this time, I'm going to play around a little bit with the Fibonacci spiral again. So let's bring that back into play. Back down to our curves. We're going to make this darker. I do want this to recede a little bit back into my background, but I also want to bring in this Fibonacci spiral into play. So we're going to click on the mask, make sure we have paintbrush selected and black. And then we're going to go in and mask off this area so it's not affected by the curves. Just like that. So that area is going to be a little bit more lit up. Let's get rid of the spiral and then take a look at that. Pretty cool. I like that. Next, we're going to work on the leaves in the pot. Again, adjustment layer, and again, curves. Isolate it to that layer. And here, again, we're going to be after kind of contrast. I want these highlights, especially out on this edge, to pop. This is part of our spiral. And I want the darks to remain dark and maybe get a little darker. So come down to our mask, again, paintbrush, black, mask off this, keep that. I like the little highlights that are kissing this area, so I'm going to keep those. And then maybe some of these darks should remain dark, give us a little more interesting contrast. Now, I don't want it to affect the pot. We're going to tackle that separately. So we're going to make another adjustment layer for the pot. Again, curves. And in the interest of time, we'll just fast forward through this a little bit. In this last step, I'm going to apply an adjustment layer to the background and choose color balance this time, and then just kind of play around with the color balance levels until I have something that feels just about right to me. Now, if we return to our value pattern, you can see a marked difference, right? There's our Fibonacci spiral. Everything's properly in place. Come back out of this. And we can also take a look at where we came from. So there's our composition and the two source images that we drew upon, this being sort of the original composition and borrowing elements from this one to the right, and coming up with a substantially more dynamic and interesting composition that we're ready to paint. Thanks for watching until the end, and once again, if you're interested in my comprehensive class on composition, head on over to Skillshare. The link is in the show notes below.